Welcome to Rising. I'm Amber Duke, and I am so excited to be back for another edition of Rising Fridays along with Jessica Burbank. Good morning, Jessica.
Good morning. Happy Friday. It's good to be back in action with you.
Absolutely. Last night, Governors Ron DeSantis and Gavin Newsom faced off in a Fox News debate where they faced off mano-a-mano after months of back and forth. Last night's biggest moment came when Newsom dropped this singer during his opening statement. Let's watch.
And there are profound differences tonight, and I look forward to engage them. But there's one thing in closing that we have in common is neither of us will be the nominee for our party in 2024.
Governor, oh my God. Great opening statement.
Later, DeSantis dragged the California governor over his handling of the state's homelessness problem.
Well, I'm looking at total time. Governor DeSantis,
look,
about 2 minutes.
He needs it.
This is a map of San Francisco. There's a lot of plots on that. You may be asking, what is that plotting? Well, this is an app where they plot the human feces that are found on the streets of San Francisco. And you see how almost the whole thing is covered, because that is what has happened in one of the previous greatest cities this country's ever had. Human feces is now a fact of life, except when a communist dictator comes to town. Then they cleaned up the streets. They lined the streets with Chinese flags.
The two governors, of course, discussed the migrant crisis.
I'm the only guy here that's a border state governor. You're trolling folks and trying to find migrants to play political games to try to get some news and attention so you can out-Trump Trump. And by the way, how's that going for you, Ron? You're down 41 points in your own home state.
And of course, the two later went head-to-head regarding their state's COVID policies and their record handling the pandemic.
On a per capita age-adjusted basis, California and Florida basically the same. Now, why is that important? Because Gavin Newsom did huge damage to people in California. He ruined livelihoods. We reopened the state very quickly. We saved thousands of jobs. We saved hundreds of thousands of jobs, thousands of businesses. We had our kids in school. He had the kids locked out of school because of the teachers union. That is having a generational impact. California has one of the lowest literacy rates in the country. In the most recent NAEP exam, Florida came in number 3 for 4th grade reading. California was far, far behind. So you should apologize for not getting your kids in school. Why didn't you get the kids in school in the summer of 2020 like we did?
You
bowed to the teachers union. You didn't do the job you should have done.
All right,
the only person
one at a time, quick answer,
is Ron DeSantis for the tens of thousands of lives that died unnecessarily because he played to the fringe of his party.
The one thing I liked out of this debate, Amber, is that Gavin Newsom said neither of us are going to be the candidate in 2024. That's the one thing.
I know, that was actually great.
What are we doing, boys? Why are we debating 2028? Is that what this is about? Let's stay on the topic of COVID for a second. I think it's kind of rich hearing DeSantis say this, because I remember moving to Florida at the very beginning of COVID. I stayed there for 2 months. And while every other state was open, restaurants were open, it was very easy to cross the border. There were no checks until I got to Florida. And then there were all of these white tents. They took my temperature through the window of the car. I had to fill out forms to promise that I didn't have COVID. It was a whole ordeal, very different from any other state. And most businesses were actually shut down. So I think it's good that Newsom points out that, like, hey, Ron DeSantis, you are wearing a mask, you're vaccinated, you followed Fauci, even though you claim to hate him. And then later on, Trump lying, or not Trump, but DeSantis lying about the COVID deaths in the state of Florida. He's still facing legal action for this. The auditor found that he was underreporting COVID deaths by a significant amount, on some days saying there were none when there were 47 that day. But the data produced by the health department was not accurate. And so this legal action is going well into 2026. So I don't know if COVID is what Ron DeSantis really wants to be talking about here. Nevertheless, the boys are having fun debating, years and years, 5 years in advance of 2028.
Yeah, I'll take your point that in the beginning, Florida was locked down maybe just as much as other states. I would say that there's a fundamental difference, though, between saying that travelers from out of state should take their temperature versus keeping kids out of school for a year. I mean, one is obviously way worse than the other. The New York Times just published an article 2 weeks ago talking about the ramifications of keeping kids out of school, whether it's learning loss, mental health issues. There's been a rise in anxiety and depression among younger people. And so I just don't think those two things are comparable when it comes to a COVID restriction. And I'm not sure what the audit is on the COVID deaths being underreported in Florida. My understanding was that that was from a whistleblower who turned out to not be accurate, but I'll have to look into that and see what exactly you're talking about there. The most recent article I can find on that is from the summer of 2022. Another part of this debate that was interesting was, of course, the fact that more Californians are leaving the state on it's a net negative migration out of California into Florida and other states like Texas. And Gavin Newsom was asked repeatedly why he thought that was happening, and he never answered the question. He just kept turning to attack Governor DeSantis. And sure, that's a fine tactic to have during a debate. People do it all the time. But when you're asked 3 times why people are leaving your state in droves and you don't have any explanation, that doesn't seem to bode well for your ability to defend your record.
Yeah, anytime there's a non-answer, you pretty much get the answer. It's that Gavin Newsom doesn't want to do much about the rising price of housing in California, which I would credit to be the major reason people are leaving California. But this is an economy that is, $39 billion, or 3.9 trillion rather. It's a huge economy. Sorry, $3.59 trillion is the total GDP annually in California. Florida has an economy that's less than half of that at $1.38 trillion. So Gavin Newsom is operating in a very different state. The size is bigger than many small countries, quite frankly. It's a very tough state to be the governor of. Ron DeSantis, having a state with an economy that's less than half of that size and a smaller population as well, he's got a very different state to govern. I don't know if we can compare apples to apples when we talk about California and Florida. It's always going to be comparing apples to oranges here. But there were a few points in this debate where I think things that were really important ended up up. You have, Gavin Newsom talking about how Ron DeSantis demeans people, even with his COVID policy. As soon as the health department got data that the virus was disproportionately affecting working class people that had to sell coffees and work in warehouses and interact with other people on a daily basis, work that my parents do, he decided to open the state up, which signals to me that he finds working class people relatively expendable. He talked about Ron DeSantis demeaning the LGBTQ community. He says, you don't need to demean and humiliate people, Ron. You don't need to talk about people in this way. I think that's an important conversation to have because those are not qualities that I associate with a leader. You should be able to be an effective leader without having to say bad things about people. And Ron DeSantis, in my view, seems kind of childish in that respect. So I'm glad that came up.
What were some of the examples that you would give of DeSantis demeaning LGBTQ people?
I think his push for this bill in schools was a huge example of this, to equate, people dressing in drag as people who are perverted, who are trying to groom children. That's an awful thing to say about someone. To talk about the LGBTQ plus community in that way, I think is detrimental, especially if people are not fully aware of where that comes from, that there could be some data, that could be legitimate, that categorizing people who do drag, who dress up for fun and dance around are somehow the same people that are grooming children is just, I think, a really bad way to categorize a population of people.
The drag bill was related to drag performers who were doing it in front of children, though. And drag is necessarily an over-exaggerated, sexualized version of femininity. These drag performers do dress scantily clad. They have the very exaggerated makeup. And so I have quite a few friends in the LGBTQ community who have a problem with drag performances taking place in public libraries or otherwise in front of children. And so I think there's a fundamental difference between saying all drag performers are groomers versus, yes, people who dance provocatively in front of children are behaving inappropriately. And on the parental rights and education bill.
At NFL games where there are cheerleaders that are dancing in a sexualized way, wearing barely any clothing. And it's like, welcome that children go to those games. I feel like that's the same thing.
I don't think that's the same thing at all. But I would also say that on the parental rights and education bill, that what that bill is talking about is not in any way demeaning LGBTQ people. It's saying that between kindergarten and third grade, you should have developmentally appropriate conversations with those kids. And in Florida, it was found that 65 to 70% of voters agreed with the contents of that bill once they read it. The only time that they opposed the bill was when they read lies in the media about it, calling it the Don't Say Gay bill.
I don't think it's appropriate to call someone a groomer of children if they dance in front of them. I mean, it's the parents' decision to take them to the show. Is it also grooming when cheerleaders are dancing in, basically a bra and underwear at an NFL game or an NBA game? To me, it's not that different. You're dancing to music.
The cheerleaders in the NFL have specific standards that they actually have specific standards for NFL cheerleaders such that their dancing is not overly provocative. And they actually fire cheerleaders who go out of their way to behave in a sexual manner during their job. And they're actually not even allowed to post certain content on social media that could be deemed unprofessional because of the fact that they are performing in a public setting.
I've been to plenty of drag shows that are not sexual. There's way more sexual dancing at many NBA and NFL games than at many drag shows. And at the end of the day, I think someone like Ron DeSantis, who wants to give parents more rights, shouldn't feel like it's his job to parent people's kids if they want to bring their kids to a drag show. Same as, the parents of kids who have a favorite football team are going to go to the game and they might see cheerleaders dancing and they might have a conversation about the over-sexualization of women's bodies, and that would be very good and healthy. But I think that's a decision that parents can very easily make. Ron DeSantis doesn't need to make the LGBTQ community seem like child groomers. To parent the children of his state. That's not his job as governor. His job is to make good pandemic policy, which he didn't do. Florida had an exorbitant amount of deaths, which he lied about. Ron DeSantis could do a lot more for Florida's economy. Now we have insurance companies leaving for farmers and agricultural insurance. Ron DeSantis hasn't done much to reverse that trend. You have farmers insurance leaving the state entirely, not wanting to operate there. What does that mean for food access in Florida and the price working people pay in food? I think there's just a lot more serious policy problems he should be focusing on as a leader rather than focusing on, rhetoric and culture wars that I don't think is the job of a governor.
Florida had the same COVID outcome in terms of deaths by population as California, despite having a much older population, which I think speaks to the success of his policies, even though they were deemed not restrictive enough by the public health bureaucracy. Unfortunately,
we don't actually have all of the COVID data from Florida yet. That's what's going to come out from the appellate judge's case into 2024.
Right, but the audit that you're talking about found that all states had the same issue with early COVID reporting because they didn't have the databases set up in order to track this kind of data. And so you could argue perhaps that for the first 2 months, maybe people were making decisions based on incomplete information, but that's not a Florida exclusive problem. That was a national problem.
Well, the whistleblower claimed accurately after leaving the department that they were not reporting data.
If you're talking about Rebecca Jones, she didn't even have access to the data that she was talking about. She inflated her position and her case was struck down by a judge. She's separate from this audit you're talking about.
The initial whistleblower that talked about it, she ended up being the person who led to an audit happening. The result of that audit was that there was a $152,000 settlement covering the legal fees of the lawsuit of this audit. They found that the Florida numbers were not accurate. Now they're facing additional legal action where the recourse is that they're going to have to continue releasing the data so that there is accurate data on Florida's COVID deaths, because what was found to be happening in the hospitals, the deaths were being underreported by the Florida Department of Health. So Ron DeSantis is facing legal action well into the next few years here, the next 3 years here, for what happened under his watch during COVID. This was reported extensively by the Miami Herald, but it didn't really get picked up by national news as much as I really think it should have been in the way that Andrew Cuomo's case was.
Yeah, I mean, it's covered in the New York Times, and their explanation of it was that there was some mismatch in the early days of the COVID pandemic in Florida between what was on the public dashboard versus what was being reported by the Florida Department of Health, and that those issues were resolved by late summer. But we'll certainly keep tracking the case and see if it turns out that Ron DeSantis faces some consequences for his alleged lies. We're going to have to leave it there. We'll be back with more Rising after this.